Hello, everyone. First, let me start just by thanking the organizers and Luciano for inviting me to present here. It's great to have this chance, although I would have wanted to visit also in person. But all right, so I'm just, as Luciano said, I'm happy to take questions throughout the seminar. I'm new to the system, so if I don't see the questions, please let me know. This paper is joined with Rafael Guntin, who is a great graduate student at NYU.
Sorry, Diego, you had to share your screen again.
All right, sorry about that. Give me 1 second. Can you all see my screen? All right.
So it's perfect. Perfect.
Sorry about that. So this paper is with Rafael Guntin. I was saying he's a great graduate student. He's from NYU, and he will be on the market this year. He's also joined with Pablo Tonello, who's a long-life co-author of mine. The title is The Microanatomy of Macro Consumption Adjustments. Our motivation for this paper is that the main macro crisis, most of the main macro crises in economic history have been characterized by large aggregate consumption adjustments. Salient examples of this crisis include the recent Euro crisis, episodes of sudden stops in emerging economies, and the Great Depression. During these episodes, aggregate consumption, the blue line, exhibits sharp contractions comparable to those of output, which is the dotted line. These episodes have attracted significant attention by macroeconomists due to the lack of consumption smoothing that is predicted by canonical business cycles theories. To date, two main hypotheses were proposed to account for the dynamics of aggregate consumption during this crisis. One is a neoclassical view of crisis that argues that consumption tracks permanent income, and that actually permanent income suffers significant contractions during this crisis, thereby leading households to a desire to adjust their consumption. Another view is what we call a credit tightening view, which argues that the access to credit during this crisis significantly tightens. And in particular, these theories, based, for example, on the presence of collateral constraints, argue that even in response to a negative transitory aggregate shock, we would observe consumption, a dropping aggregate consumption because of households not being able to smooth consumption due to the tightening of the constraints. Our paper is about one key idea, which is that these two theories that can account for the aggregate dynamics of consumption have substantially different predictions for the adjustments at the cross-section. In particular, according to the credit tightening view, one prediction is that income-rich households with sufficient liquid assets should be able to smooth the consumption. On the other hand, according to the permanent income view of crisis, it should be all households, including those income-rich with liquid assets, that should adjust their consumption. Therefore, what we propose is that studying the micro-level anatomy of adjustments of consumption during this crisis can inform this long-lasting debate in macro and international. So here's what we do in one slide. We first start by actually conducting an empirical study of the micro-level consumption responses during episodes of crisis by looking at microdata. We study 5 episodes of large consumption adjustments that span the Euro crisis and episodes of emerging markets and stops. Our key main finding is that we find that actually income-rich households with liquid assets significantly adjust consumption. In fact, we find generalized large consumption adjustments across the income distribution and across other households' characteristics. We argue that this makes it challenging to explain these patterns of consumption adjustment purely based on tightening of borrowing constraints. In the second part of the paper, we use these data to evaluate theories of macro consumption adjustments. For this, we developed first a quantitative heterogeneous agent model of a small open economy of savings and borrowing and consumption that is designed to fit the micro level patterns at the steady states. And we then feed in 2 crisis experiments that capture the views that I was talking in the previous slide about the aggregate consumption dynamics during crisis. We actually find that according to a credit tightening view of crisis, this predicts a decaying pattern of consumption adjustments along the income distribution, with poor households adjusting more than income-rich households. This is something that we don't observe in the data. On the other hand, we argue that the permanent income view of crisis goes a long way in explaining the cross-sectional patterns of consumption adjustments that we observe in the data. We argue that actually then discerning between these 2 views has important implications for the design and the effectiveness of demand-stimulating policies. In particular, according to the credit tightening view, these policies are much less powerful in the permanent income view, in which agents are more closer to being Ricardian, than in the credit tightening view, in which households would really consume more out of stimulus that they get. Let me, before also, just from start, clarify things that we don't do in the paper. So one thing that we don't do in the paper is we do not challenge the role of financial frictions, neither for fitting the data, the micro level patterns that we observe in steady states for distribution of consumptions, income, and wealth, nor we rule out the role of financial frictions during this crisis in determining the path of economic activity. As you'll see in our theory is going to take as given the path of output. We're going to actually call it income, and we're going to be agnostic about what is the shock and how it propagates to the path of income. What we're going to be mostly talking about is for a given path of income that we observe in the data, aggregate and idiosyncratic, how can we rationalize the consumption responses to that? So that's kind of like an overview of the paper. If there's any questions, otherwise, I'll just let me briefly touch on the literature. Our paper is, yeah.
Can I ask something just to clarify? When you are going to a data, are you thinking on this permanent income shock as an aggregate income shock with a lot of persistence, or idiosyncratic shocks, or persistent idiosyncratic shocks, or both? Or
we're going to be thinking of the crisis being an aggregate shock, and we're in the beginning, we're going to basically consider 2 types of shocks depending on which view of the crisis we're in. In the permanent income view, we're going to consider a permanent shock. In the credit tightening view, we're going to consider a transitory shock together with a tightening of the borrowing constraints. That motivation is mostly driven by what the literature has thought about modeling this crisis in the macro models. In addition to that, we will also feature idiosyncratic shocks whose distribution in the baseline model will not shift in response to the aggregate shock, although in extensions, we also consider movements in the second moments, for example, of this idiosyncratic shocks distribution. So our paper is related.
Can I ask you something? I'm Álvaro Aguirre from the Central Bank. So just to clarify, so what you're trying to see is if these big recessions affect consumption because of a drop in permanent income or because of frictions, right? You're not like saying that one model that has a friction will explain better business cycles than one in which there are no friction or something like that. Because at the end, with or without frictions, the rich guys will always adjust consumption if it is a permanent income shock, right? Even in these models with financial frictions and idiosyncratic shocks. So
exactly.
The guys will perform the same. So I guess you're saying that you don't observe a difference between the rich guys and the poor guys, and that tells you that this is a change in permanent income and not another a transitory shock that is magnified by frictions?
Exactly. So I think you got it right. So that's what we're saying. Just a couple of disclaimers related to what I said before, which are useful to say them now. Basically, this is going to be mostly a model about the dynamics during crisis. We're going to have just one single exercise in which we extend to business cycle frequencies, although as we say in the paper, our model is mostly about understanding the dynamics within this big crisis. You're right that our conclusions are going to be about which of these two views can better capture the micro patterns. That being said, as I said, a couple of things is first, we're not saying that models shouldn't, the models with the neoclassical model will perform better in any other dimension than models with frictions. So for example, one outstanding question that our paper kind of leaves open, and there's much literature that has been working on that, is why are actually these shocks permanent? Let's say that actually the better view of the crisis is the one with permanent aggregate shocks. Then why is it that these shocks are of permanent nature? It could well be, and this is something that our paper will not touch on, but as I said, there's a literature on this. It could well be that it's actually a transitory initial shock that is magnified through frictions and becoming near permanent, for example, due to disruptions in intermediaries, and that just shows up in the path of economic activity. So that's something that we won't be touching, and that's why actually I put that disclaimer on the things that we don't do on the paper, because I mean it's immediate to think the things that you saw, Alvaro, and it's just that our focus is gonna be kind of well defined into just by given a path of income, which we are not gonna try to explain how it arrives. We just want to infer which of these two views of crisis can better explain the cross-sectional pattern of consumption adjustment.
Okay, so can I add something? So there is another effect, right, that it is present in when there are financial frictions, which is an adjustment in consumption due to precautionary motives, right? So maybe this is not a permanent shock, but it is a very uncertain time when these guys want to save more because of precautionary motives. I don't know how strong is that for your rich guys, right? It depends on how rich are these guys. But at the end, this effect that can generate a reduction in consumption for rich guys is present in models with financial frictions, but not in models without financial frictions.
So one of the things I agree with you, Alvaro, and we actually try to put numbers into that increasing uncertainty. So one of the extensions we consider, and I'll make sure I click on it at the right time to address your point back in some time, is we also feed in an increase in uncertainty. So in basically an increase in idiosyncratic uncertainty regarding your income. That's something which we add to the views as an additional moment potentially, and we discipline it with the observed dispersion of income that also increases, as you rightly point, during crisis. However, as I'll show you when the time comes, that cannot quantitatively account for the strong consumption adjustments that we observe in the rich people.
Okay.
So let me briefly touch briefly on the literature. Our paper is related to the literature that studies consumption crisis. These have been labeled consumption disasters in the context of also sudden stops, financial crisis. Then our paper is also related to the literature that studies international business cycles and capital flows, and also in the closed economy literature of household heterogeneity. Our contribution is basically to propose that looking at the micro patterns of consumption adjustment during crisis can inform about theories of aggregate dynamics during crisis. So here's what I'll do for the remainder of the talk. I'll just first go through the theory, which will be helpful in disciplining what we should look at when we go to the next part, which is our empirical analysis, which we will be guided by theory. Then I will come back to the model and perform a quantitative analysis of the model. So this is the baseline model. It's a small open economy with a continuum of agents indexed by I. The preferences are given towards expected consumption, expected utility out of consumption. There's risk aversion in there. And we're going to consider, as I said, an endowment economy in which the individual endowment of an agent is going to be composed of an increasing function of its idiosyncratic component, mu I, and its aggregate component, big YI. We're going to consider the idiosyncratic component to be stochastic, and the aggregate component, we're going to be basically thinking of it as deterministic, and then we're going to do MIT type of shocks to it. In the model, we also have an extension in which we do also aggregate risk and also a shock in there. In most of our analysis, I will be focusing on the following structure for this H function, which is the multiplicative one. Basically, the endowment of an individual is going to be the product of idiosyncratic component times the aggregate component. We also study more flexible H's in the quantitative analysis that allows us to better fit the impact of the crisis on individuals' income. We were going to consider an incomplete markets model with the presence of a riskless bond in which households can save or borrow. So its budget constraint is consumption is equal to its endowment or income, plus the savings there and the returns of savings for a previous period, net of savings for the following period. We introduce financial frictions in this model through the presence of a borrowing constraint. This hard borrowing constraint is going to be modeled as kappa times a function of the aggregate income. This function is flexible. We're actually going to parameterize it. Examples of these functions include one in which the borrowing constraint does not depend on aggregate income. That corresponds to a fixed debt limit in all BD models. And we're going to also consider a strictly increasing function of the aggregate income. This will capture financial amplification mechanisms by which recession tightens the borrowing constraints of households. The mechanism through which this occurs, we're not going to take a stance in here. We're just going to impose it as a reduced form. But what we have in mind is, for example, what many literature has actually modeled it and endogenized it properly, which is, for example, the fact that during recession, asset prices drops, so that tightens the value of collateral, for example. As I said, and let me just reiterate so we're clear on this, our paper is going to be silent on what financial frictions, the role of financial frictions affecting the production during this crisis. So we're going to consider two aggregate crisis experiments in this economy. Just think of the economy in the steady state with a stationary distribution, and then we're going to hit the economy with two aggregate shocks that will resemble the views that I told in the introduction. Let me first describe the permanent income crisis experiment. That's basically an aggregate income shock that is permanent in nature. In particular, the log aggregate income will follow a shock, which will be hit by a shock which is potentially persistent in the growth rates. So when rho is equal to 0, that's a random walk shock. When rho is positive, that's even persistent in growth rates. The other characteristics of this permanent income view is that the borrowing constraint will be unaffected by the shock. That is, the borrowing constraint remains as it is. On the other hand, and in contrast, the credit tightening view crisis experiment, that's going to basically feature an aggregate shock which is transitory, that is potentially mean reverting in levels with a degree of reversion captured by rho y, and together with a tightening of the borrowing constraints, in which we denote epsilon fy, the elasticity of the borrowing constraint to the aggregate shock. As you'll see, both experiments will be able to account for the same aggregate income and consumption dynamics during this crisis. And what we will be focusing on is on the cross-sectional responses for households with different idiosyncratic income levels. So to make further progress characterizing this analytical, let me first show you an analytical example. Then when I go back to the quantitative model, we'll just do more realistic assumptions regarding utilities, etc. But for this case, for now, focus on the case of quadratic utility and beta times 1 plus r equal to 1. As I said, we're also going to focus on the multiplicative case of idiosyncratic income. In that case, the Euler equation is linear in consumption. and looks like this. And once you iterate forward on the Euler equation and use the budget constraint, what you end up obtaining is an expression for the optimal consumption. The optimal consumption implies consuming a flow out of the stock of outstanding liquid assets of the individual, plus a flow out of the permanent income of the household. And then that's the unrestricted level of consumption. It may be that actually the presence of borrowing constraints make this unrestricted level of consumption unfeasible. That will show up mathematically as basically the value of the shadow value of hitting the borrowing constraint either today or in the future. What we're going to focus on, and we will be deriving analytical predictions for, is the following statistical object in the data, in the model and in the data. We're going to focus on consumption to income elasticities. We're going to denote this by this, which are going to be the elasticity of an individual agent in response to these two aggregate shocks that I was saying here, the two crisis experiments. So it's going to be the idiosyncratic consumption to income elasticity, leaving fixed the idiosyncratic shock and just moving the aggregate shock. We're going to focus on these elasticities when the interest rate is small enough, because we're going to obtain analytical predictions for that. We're going to relax also this R being going to zero in our quantitative analysis with the same qualitative predictions as I'll show you right now. Here's the characterization of the responses of the consumption of each household in each of the two views of the crisis. Let me first start, actually, the main bottom line out of this line is that the predictions of the consumption responses will differ across these two views. Let me first start by actually showing you and characterizing the consumption responses under the permanent income view. Under this model, what we have is that income-rich households will have elasticities that are as large as the average elasticity in the households. Why is that in the economy? Why is that? Well, let's first focus on two cases, the case of constrained households and the case of permanently unconstrained households. So constrained households are households in which basically their level of debt is pinned down by the borrowing constraint. And if that doesn't change in the crisis, then basically they are virtually hand-to-mouth households. So if their income falls, their current income falls, so will their consumption. So the elasticity of consumption to income for those constrained households will be equal to 1. Interestingly, for permanently unconstrained households, the elasticities will also be equal to 1, but for different reasons. These households are permanent income households, which they are not constrained. But if they're, for example, in the case in which the shock is random walking levels, rho g equals to 0, then the elasticities will also be equal to 1, just because in this case, not only current income is falling, but also permanent income is falling and consumption responds to permanent income. So this is kind of the prediction in response to a permanent income view of crisis. We have different predictions under the credit tightening view of crisis. Under this view, we have that income-rich households will feature consumption to income elasticities that are lower than the average one. Why? Because let's kind of start again as we did by focusing on constrained and unconstrained households. On the one hand, constrained households are households that are basically just their level of borrowing is determined by the borrowing constraint. In this case, their consumption will fall due to two reasons. First, their income is falling. Second, there is a deleveraging that households need to incur due to the tightening of the borrowing constraint. That implies mathematically that the consumption to income elasticity of these households will be actually a function, will be greater than 1, and will be an increasing function of the elasticity of the borrowing constraint to the aggregate shock. That stands in contrast to the response of permanently unconstrained households under the credit tightening view. Under this view, since the aggregate shock is transitory, the elasticities of consumption to income are going to be less than 1. That is, there's going to be consumption smoothing for those households. In particular, the elasticity will be, it will be actually, sorry, there's a type in clear, it should be increasing in the persistence of the shock in levels, and in particular, in the star case in which the shock completely dissipates after one period, the elasticities are sufficiently small. The one last thing that I need to tell you is, okay, who are constrained households and who are unconstrained households in these models? Well, if we assume that the idiosyncratic shock is mean reverting, and the data seems to suggest that, then actually the households with low enough mu I are going to be more likely to be constrained, and the households with high enough idiosyncratic income are more likely to be unconstrained. So that's kind of like our theoretical prediction, and that's what we're going to basically be looking now at in the data. So,
yeah. Sorry, just this is a little bit, I think, related to my previous question. How, and I want to ask this here because you just said that this mu YT, that is idiosyncratic shock, is mean reverting. How this connects to the literature like Blandel et al. And all these guys that try to estimate the marginal effect of income on consumption using microdata, where they are, I think they are trying to separate permanent and transitory incomes, income shocks, and how they affect differently to consumption at the cross-sectional level. Meaning that I think that these papers actually reveals that there are important permanent income shocks, but idiosyncratic permanent income shocks that affect consumption. There is some relationship of this literature to what you are presenting here?
There is indeed. So that's a great question, Chano. Basically, what Blandel et al. Do is basically just they try to tease out of the individual consumption data the role of, as you said, permanent and idiosyncratic shocks. They don't focus on aggregate shocks. So that's kind of like why. So in here, for example, individual will respond to idiosyncratic and both aggregate shocks. What we are kind of like assuming in here, which is, let's say, some degree of simplification relative to Blandel et al., is we're going to consider one source of idiosyncratic shock, which will potentially, as kind of like you said, compared to Blandel, which they assume the presence of potentially two and try to discipline that out of consumption data. We're going to simplify here and just assume, let's say, potentially mean reverting idiosyncratic shock. That means that our mean reversion of the idiosyncratic shock, if again we isolate from the aggregate shocks, which are, as we'll try to argue, of more of a permanent nature, it only responds to the idiosyncratic shock. That mean reversion may actually compose a mixture of the pure mean reversion that they get and the permanent shocks that they get. So we kind of like, as we estimate in the data, we're gonna get some degree of mean reversion, but potentially persistent. I think that wouldn't affect much our results if we try to kind of, again, using data discipline this process by potentially a mixture of the two processes that they consider. To the extent that there are some idiosyncratic shocks, then this characterization of models in this model, which is, by the way, that's an important characterization. We will be leveraging on this prediction that income poor are going to be more likely to be constrained than income rich, right? But I think that would be preserved even if we allow for these two processes, as Blandel et al. Do in most of their research. Yeah, that's my answer, Chan.
Okay.
Good. Actually, one last thing also, just to Chan also, one of the things we do is we replicate the BBP analysis in our data, and we find similar results in here. Both in I think we do it both in the data and also in the model generated data. That I don't remember quite, but basically we just do the composition and look at the MPCs out of the transitory shock and out of the temporary shock, finding similar estimates. We do it for Italy, we do it also for Peru, in which we have ton of data. Yeah, there was another question.
Yes, hi Diego, Andres Fernandez here.
Hello, Andres.
Great to have you in our seminar. So I have a couple of questions. First is a clarification question. So one thing we do know, which has been extensively documented for these kind of episodes that you guys study, is that at least for emerging markets, these episodes occur with very big increases in the interest rate, right? This is actually what gave birth, so to speak, to the financial frictions literature that you referred to at the beginning. So, so my question here is, who bears through the lens of this theory, who bears the brunt of these large increases in interest rate? I would assume that it's the constrained households who somehow face a shadow interest rate that increases. It needs to increase so that they cannot smooth consumption.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So that's a great question, Andres. Thank you for asking. Because it is indeed right that I mean, there's a lot of literature that levies on this, and we have thought about it, right? We actually look at the data for this a little bit. The question is, and the big question is, which is the relevant interest rates for the household? So one pass that we did in our data, it was to first look at the interest rates out of the bank deposits and bank consumer credits. So in that case, as you also correctly point out, the increase in the interest rate is more striking for episodes of sudden stops in emerging economy, not so much, for example, for the Euro crisis episode, the one in Italy, for example. So I'll show you some data, hopefully, if I have time, about these two dynamics of the interest rates. The other thing that we do observe in the data is that there is an asymmetric increase in the interest rate for a higher interest rate increase. For example, in the case of the tequila crisis in Mexico or the global financial crisis in Mexico, in both these episodes, there is a higher increase for households that are borrowing than for households that are saving. So basically, the deposit rate kind of doesn't increase much. The borrowing rate does increase much, which is consistent with the view that the literature, which also includes your work, reflects this idea of, higher interest rates is also reflecting some sort of risk premium shock, in which really the relevant interest rate is increasing more for the borrowing, right? So that is kind of like something we analyze in the data. In one of the extensions, I'll try to hit on it when the time comes, which is we also feed in increases in the interest rates that we observe in the data. That being said, we're not gonna say a lot of effects of big effects on consumption, because the changes in the interest rates are not that large for the saving rates, and most of our households, as in the data, will be saving. So that's an important thing. The other thing, as I said, and again, I'm sympathetic, is to, okay, maybe the rates we're looking at in the data are not the relevant ones. Maybe actually the relevant rates are, maybe some rates of bonds. But since our focus is mostly on households, that's why we chose to look at the data. But yeah.
This is great. That actually answers my second question, which is whether you had looked at data on interest rates. So looking forward, I mean, if we can leave this for the end, but the other rate I would look at is, but I understand that you leave this out, is the rate to loans to firms, right?
Exactly. Great, Andres. I think you're going to the other point, which is also which you have worked, and I've also have some work on this. Is that these rates for firms do increase much more, right? Like the borrowing rates, for example, international capital market spikes during these episodes, especially for emerging economies, and that we would tend to think that may have indeed a strong effect on the, for example, investment decision of firms and the production decision of firms. In fact, something that I have with parallel work on Pablo, and our work is completely sympathetic with the idea that you have in mind, is that for firms, this financial friction story is actually much more relevant. That's what our preliminary analysis during this crisis is suggesting, that actually financial frictions for the firm side, in which you do indeed observe significant increases in the interest rates, that does indeed to point to show, even once you look at the micro data, that that plays a role in the investment decision of firms during this crisis.
Great, thanks, Diego.
Okay, perfect. So that was kind of the theory. If there's any other question on the theory, this is a great moment to ask. Otherwise, what I'll do is now I'll jump into the empirical analysis, which is motivated by the theory. So what we're gonna be focusing on is on 5 episodes of large consumption crisis. 2 in the Euro crisis, which is the Italy and the Spanish recession, and 3 emerging markets and stops, which are the tequila crisis in Mexico, the global financial crisis in Mexico, and in Peru. These episodes are widely studied in the literature, and they have the advantage that we do have available micro data to study the individual consumption adjustments. As you see in these plots, these are significant recessions in not only in which output, aggregate output went down, but also aggregate consumption, in particular non-durable consumption, went down by as much, almost as much as outputs in all episodes. These are also severe crises in which the peak to trough drops of detrended output range from 8% to something like 15%.
Diego,
Yeah.
this is Ernesto. I think that it's very informative to look at cases in which consumption dropped as much as output, as is informative to see at cases where consumption does not fall as much as output. Do you rule out those later cases for any reason?
That's a good suggestion. I mean, that's a great suggestion, by the way. We should be looking at that. I'm not gonna show you because I don't have much on that, but I agree that they're super informative. In advanced economies, we observe, like, for example, in the Great Recession, the latest global financial crisis in the US, the consumption behavior was something like that. And I mean, we had some preliminary analysis, we just don't have it in here. But I think I agree with you that these are as informative as these ones. But in the case, since our motivation is mostly to explain the lack of consumption smoothing, that's kind of why we're focusing mostly on these episodes and not on the standard advanced economy recession, in which you do observe some consumption smoothing. Because, by the way, Italy and Spain behaved more like emerging economies in these episodes than advanced economies. So our data will come from households expenditure and income service, as well as household.
Sorry, Diego, for interrupting you again. So we have a question from the attendee. So give me 1 sec to open the mic for him. So now, Benjamin, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Benjamin. A bit of what Ernesto asked, and if you can go back 1 slide. Like, I don't know, just looking at the graph, but the case of Italy looks kind of interesting, as like the first drop in output kind of like have a smallish drop in consumption, and then the second one is kind of like one-on-one. So it may be that you like first you get rid of your savings or something like that, and then the second drop caught you without anything to do the smoothness and the smoothing, and then you have to drop like one-on-one the consumption with respect to the drop in output. Because you can see, like in the first one that I think is 2008, consumption doesn't drop much, but after 2011, 2012, I don't know exactly, kind of like the drop in consumption is much one-on-one with respect to output. I don't know if you can make a difference between these 2 episodes in the same country, like is one after the other.
That's a good point. We think of it as a protracted episode. We do some robustness in where defining peak to trough. So I think it is true, as you're saying, that if you just focus first on the first sub episode, then you would observe indeed some consumption smoothing. And I would have to remember what the micro patterns were in that sub episode, if you want. And I think that's a great suggestion. I think we did. I just don't remember exactly what the takeaway was. And then, but in our baseline, we're just going to consider the full recession from actually peaking in 2007, I think, to the trough in 2013 as the full episode. But yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Benjamin.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so our data comes from this service, as I was telling. It's frequency, it's either annual or biennial, depending on the country. For all of the episodes, we're going to have repeated cross-sectional data, but for Italy and Peru, we have this addition of a panel dimension of the survey, which we will exploit for certain episodes. We perform some data representative analysis, in which I won't get in, but They kind of track the aggregate national accounts data quite well. Our baseline measure follows basically the literature that Luciano was referring to, and we focus basically on monetary non-durable consumption as our baseline measure of consumption, and monetary non-financial after-tax income. We follow standard practice in the literature by residualizing these variables on certain households covariates like household size, the region in which they live, the age, the education, and gender of the household heads. The results are robust to considering other measures of consumption, which include durable and also other measures of income. Let me kind of pause and just a little bit and describe in detail which is the statistic we will be looking at in the data. Remember that our main measure, our predictions for the theory was to look at the consumption to income elasticity of an individual agent given in response to the aggregate shock, but leaving constant the idiosyncratic shock. When we go to the data, a challenge arises, which is in this crisis, not only the aggregate shock, but also idiosyncratic shocks are moving. You may have people that are doing well during crisis just purely due to their idiosyncratic reasons. So how do we overcome this? Well, we basically compute consumption to income elasticities for the average household in a particular income decile. So we do so by computing the ratio of the log change in the average consumption of households in a decile to the log change in the average income in a decile. By averaging in an income decile, we're washing out the effects of idiosyncratic shocks and just focusing on the responses of these variables in response to the aggregate shock. We're gonna follow a peak to trough analysis, as I was hinting, in which here are the dates we consider for each of the episodes of analysis. So as I said, we focus on this measure because it approximates well the theoretical object. Actually, one of the things that we do in a quantitative analysis is we show that the theoretical object in the model, for the model, we can actually compute the theoretical object because our model is in our command. And the empirical object in the model simulated data are super close to each other. So that also gives us confidence that this washing out indeed occurs in model simulated data. And as I said, these consumption to income elasticities are going to be, as I mentioned in the theory part, very useful to distinguish between theories of macro consumption adjustments. We also discuss other commonly analyzed measures such as consumption to income elasticities, leaving fixed the income of households, the group of households pre-crisis and post-crisis for those countries for which we have panel data. We also look at median individual elasticities, and we also look at MPCs. For example, for the case of MPCs, the differences between the theories are quantitative, not necessarily qualitative. So that's when we address them when we do go to our quantitative model. That being said, let me first show you the kind of like our main empirical results, which is highlighted in this table. This table shows in the columns the responses for each of the episodes. The last column is the average. And then in here we have the drop in output in log income, the drop in log consumption, and the elasticity, which is basically the ratio of those two. We have two separate rows. One is the average household, and the other one is the top income household, basically considering the top income decile. The most important result is, first, consistent with the aggregate data, we observe average elasticities that are close to 1. So basically, aggregate in the average, consumption drops by almost as much as output. There's, again, dispersion across episodes, but the same picture emerges mostly. The key takeaway out of our analysis is once we focus attention on the top income deciles, we also observe significant consumption adjustments, in this case of consumption to income elasticities of 0.98. These graphs complement our analysis by now showing you the consumption to income elasticities for different income deciles in the x-axis. So there's income deciles in the x-axis, consumption to income elasticities in the y-axis. What we observe is somehow certain differentiated pattern across Euro crisis and emerging market sudden stops. In particular, across Euro crisis, we observe somewhat of a flat pattern of consumption to income elasticities, both in Spain and in Italy, that is near 1. On the other hand, on emerging market crisis, we observe a slightly increasing pattern of consumption to income elasticities with low consumption to income elasticities for income poor people. We're gonna jointly rationalize this differential pattern of elasticities once we incorporate to our baseline model the presence of non-homostheticities. So basically, if non-homostheticities, which we model as Tongeri subsistence type of level of consumption, is more relevant for poorer countries like Mexico and Peru than it is for advanced economies like Italy and Spain, actually the poorer countries of the poor households of the poor countries are going to be much more reluctant in adjusting consumption because they may fall actually quite close to the subsistence level.
Can I ask you something? So you don't have wealth data, right? And I guess you're aware that the predictions of the model depends on wealth, not on income, right?
It's coming up, but go ask. Please ask the question, and then I'll.
Yeah. So there are two things I think that are important there. One is that maybe these very rich guys suffer mostly falling wealth because of this crisis, because of changes in exchange rate or something like that, and a fall in asset prices in general. And the other is that this depends not only on wealth but also on liquid wealth, right? And maybe these high income guys are very rich, but they have all of their assets in very illiquid assets, or their savings in illiquid assets, and maybe then they are as constrained as the poorer guys.
Great. So I think both are great questions, and they come in quite handy. So let me answer the first one, and then I'll get back to the first one when the time comes. So we do indeed. So it is right, as you correctly point out, income rich households also have higher stocks of, let's say, wealth invested in risky assets, and it is also true that during these episodes asset prices drop. So one thing that we observe is larger negative liquid wealth revaluations for income-rich households than for income-poor households. We're going to actually measure that in the data, Alvaro. We do it using the survey of consumer finances for the countries for which we have data. And we're going to feed in the wealth revaluation through the lens of the model and try to see how much of that accounts for the consumption responses. It will indeed increase the elasticities of consumption for the income rich, but just a little bit. And that's because basically consumption, the households only consume a flow out of the liquid wealth, and the stocks of liquid wealth to income are around 1 year of income. So even though the revaluations are large, the impact on consumption is going to be small, according to the model. That's in response to the first question. But I'll touch. We can resume this when I'll show you the actual exercise. The second exercise is mostly motivated also to your question, which is it's also true as Alvaro was pointing out that it could well be that income-rich people are wealthy hand-to-mouth people. That is, households that are income-rich, they have also wealth, but it's just all invested in liquid assets. So in order to actually make sure that that's not driving the behavior of the income-rich people, one thing that we do is we focus on those households now that have significant liquid assets, as defined by Capellan and Violante in some of their papers. So this is the table. The same.
Sorry, can I interrupt you? So if you have data on wealth, why don't you take the derivatives, so the elasticities by wealth deciles instead of income deciles?
I have it in one graph. I don't actually. We'll find similar. I think it's a little more choppy. I think mostly because the wealth measures are more inaccurate in the data. So that's why one of the reasons for where we also focus on income rather than on wealth. But I think I won't have it in here to click. If I would have showed you. But similar patterns emerge. Basically, the flatness is also in there.
Because still, so when you were saying that you have the average by decile and then you're taking just the aggregate effect, still the deciles of income and wealth are affected differently, right, from an aggregate shock. So
that's also that's another point that is also true, and we will come again. Like you're going to great questions that we have answers for. Let me hold on that one so that I don't. Then I'll make sure I'll get back to it when the time comes. So so then, as Alvaro was saying, like what we're doing in here is basically focusing now on all agents with liquid assets and redoing our analysis. This is the same average elasticities. Now this is the average elasticity of households with liquid assets, and this is the top income elasticities of households with liquid assets. Again, high elasticities, no significant consumption adjustment that is almost similar for both the average and the top income. So the other thing that I do, and also relates kind of like to Alvaro's concern, is another thing that we do to kind of like address that concern is we split households with differential wealth to income ratio. So let's focus now on the low wealth to income ratios. Those are households that most of their consumption is basically financed by income, permanent income, right? So for those households, you could think, okay, the consumption will respond mostly to their shock to income. We look at, again, the differential consumption to income elasticities for top and average, and we again find similar results. Other things that we do in the paper is we, motivated by the fact that income-rich households consume different consumption baskets than income poor, we look at the elasticities of consumption to income for more narrowly defined types of goods. In particular, we focus on durables and non-durables. We focus on tradables and non-tradables, and luxury and basics goods. One thing that emerges out of this analysis is that the consumption to income elasticities display heterogeneity across these types of goods. For example, the consumption to income elasticities for luxury goods is much more larger, actually greater than 2, than the consumption to income elasticities for basic goods. But what's relevant for our analysis is that within a certain type of good, the consumption to income elasticities of average and rich income households are similar. Another thing, yeah, Chano.
Sorry, can I interrupt you just to see if I get this right? It's related to how you are measuring this effect of aggregate income to consumption. You're saying that for every decile, you're averaging across households in order to take away the idiosyncratic shock. So then you have like an average object, and you are looking at the average consumption and average income within this decile, and look at this correlation across a time series.
No, we look peak to trough, Chano. So let me kind of go back to, we look at the drop, peak to trough of average consumption for the income decile, and the drop in the average income for a given income decile, and that's how our elasticity. So for example, if you want to understand this 1.19, this is actually 0.18 divided by 0.15 negative. That's how we get our 0.19, 1.19.
Okay. And this delta is different in 2 different periods. Actually, yeah. I think my question is, and I don't know, given that this is not for all the context of panel data, like the households that belongs to one decile in one particular period of time are actually the same household that belongs to the same decile in another particular point in time.
That's true, Chano. That's true, Chano. And here, what I'm showing you now, I just clicked on it because this goes to your question. What we do in this one, we only have 2 countries, right? You have Italy and Peru, because those are the countries for which we have panel data. So this is the same analysis, but now fixing the groups of people with the pre-crisis income decile. So the same people that I look for the consumption in the pre-crisis, I will look for their consumption in the post-crisis. And these are the elasticities. We have the higher elasticities, but again, the same type of analysis emerges. Okay?
Okay. Thanks.
Great.
Hello, hi, Diego. Can I interrupt? I'm Jorge here.
Sure.
So there are 2 recent critiques of a BPP approach. One in the AJ macro by Kumalt about the assumption of low consumption being a random walk. But the other one that I think is more relevant for you is Morley, Journal of Applied Econometrics. They show that a quasi-maximum likelihood approach
really changes the result of BPP, basically decreasing a lot the response of permanent consumption to permanent income, and changing a lot the heterogeneity of responses across household characteristics. So I think that it would be relevant if you could use their code and check whether similar things apply. It is available there.
Thank you, Jorge. I didn't know about those critiques, so I'll follow up later with you to see about those papers because we are super interested in that. Thank you for the suggestion. So basically, the other thing that we do is let me just take, we have a half hour more, right, or something like. Right. So another thing that we do is we also motivated, for example, by this paper by Kravino and Levchenko, which finds that there are differential, especially when the exchange rate moves in this crisis, or emerging markets and stops, not necessarily the euro crisis. There's also differential patterns of inflation for each income decile. So what Kravino and Levchenko document, and we also incorporate in our model, is the fact that inflation increases more for income poor than for income rich. So one of the things that we do is we redo our analysis by considering income decile specific inflations, which again is more relevant for emerging markets and stops than for the euro crisis, and kind of again the results are kind of similar. The last thing that we do is we address the role of permanent heterogeneity. So one of the things that can happen here also is maybe what we're reflecting is just the fact that income rich people are presumably, let's say, different than income poor, and so along some unobservable, let's say, the degree of risk aversion that in turn leads to kind of higher consumption volatilities, higher consumption elasticities for income rich, just due to the permanent heterogeneity. That's kind of a hard task to address. What we're doing here is we exploit the panel, those countries for which we have panel dimension, estimate permanent consumption to income elasticities for those households, and then group them in different bins. So basically high consumption to income, permanent consumption to income elasticities during the whole time series, right? And then low, and then we also again now look at the crisis elasticities. Again, what we find is in this case, we also find consistent with the fact that the low elasticities have lower elasticities, of course, during the crisis as well. And high elasticity households have high elasticities during the crisis. But importantly, we don't observe significantly differences between average and top income. One other thing that we do is we then kind of like ask more broadly whether we observe certain type of a pattern of consumption smoothing along some observable. So we kind of like cut the data in various dimensions, one being across age, across education attainment, households working in different sectors, business owners and non-business owners, house owners and renters, and households in different regions. So basically, the bottom line is we fail to observe significant consumption smoothing across any of these household characteristics. The last thing that we do in the empirics, and then this is the last slides of the empirics, then I'll move to the model, is what we try to do in here, and I think this was related to one of Alvaro's questions, is we basically extend our analysis to business cycle frequencies. So what we're doing here is for Italy, and we also do it for the US. So kind of like, again, this is not what Ernesto was asking, but it's approximate. At least we're looking at a country that displays aggregate consumption smoothing, right? Which is the US. So what we're doing in this case is we take the consumption, the change in the consumption for a given income quintile, and we regress it on the change in the income at the not at the business cycle frequencies, because this is kind of like annual data, but for a long time period. And then we estimate these kind of like elasticities, which incorporate again normal times. So here are the elasticities that we estimate for Italy, and these are the estimates for the US. So one thing that we observe is the same lack of consumption smoothing that we observe for Italy in the crisis. We also observe it in normal times, at least for most of the income quintiles. Something that we don't observe in the US. Once we look at the US, and this is also reassuring of the aggregate consumption data, we observe much lower consumption to income elasticities for all income quintiles in the US than for Italy. Okay, so In the next minutes, basically what I'll do is I'll use the reminder minutes to kind of provide you now with the quantitative analysis. So I'll go back to the model and try to now make a quantitative exercises of the two crisis view and compare to see how well this model can account for the patterns that we observe in the data. So we're going to calibrate our model. Our baseline calibration is going to be for Italy. And since there are some differences of emerging markets and stops and Euro crisis episodes, we'll also pursue a calibration for Mexico. We calibrate our model using two steps. First, we calibrate the steady state of the model, basically by matching the patterns, the parameters associated to the idiosyncratic income process to match certain micro moments. And then we feed in the two views of crisis introduced as unexpected aggregate shocks. So we use CRRA, idiosyncratic income, as I was saying, to channel an AR1 process. We fix certain standard parameters like risk aversion, the risk-free rate, and then we calibrate the process of idiosyncratic shock to match panel moments of income, and then we calibrate the discount factor and the strength of the borrowing constraint to match two key moments, which are, for example, the share of wealth, the aggregate wealth, liquid wealth to income ratio, which is something close to 1 of annual income, as I was telling Álvaro at one point. And then the share of hand to mouth as measured by Kaplan and Violante, which is households with less than a certain fraction of liquid wealth to income ratios, which is 23 in the Italian data. Then what we do is we're going to feed in the two crisis experiments. And the one important thing of our calibration exercises is we're going to target the aggregate consumption to income elasticities in both experiments. So that's going to be a target of our calibration. How do we target? How can we identify the aggregate consumption to income elasticities in both crisis episodes? Well, it's actually due to different parameters. In particular, under the permanent income view crisis experiment, we can calibrate the aggregate, we can calibrate basically the persistence of the shock in the growth rate to match the aggregate consumption to income elasticities. On the other hand, under the credit tightening view experiment, we can calibrate the elasticity of the borrowing constraint to match, again, the aggregate consumption to income elasticity. So we're going to parameterize the borrowing constraint as kappa times y to the nu, and then we're going to calibrate this nu so that we get an aggregate consumption to income elasticity. That's something that's observed in the data, which is something close to 1. This is how the dynamics of the aggregate shock look like under the two crisis experiments. This is aggregate income. Under the credit tightening view, there's a recession that then mean reverts with certain persistence. And in the permanent income view, there's a recession that basically is even slightly persistent in growth rates. On the other hand, the dynamics of the borrowing constraints are unchanged for the permanent income view and tightening with a certain elasticity to income in the credit tightening view. This is what we gathered, we think the most important picture of our paper, which is how the model performs in the cross-sectional responses of consumption to income elasticities under the two views of crisis. So here is the permanent income view of crisis. The orange line is the model responses, and the blue line is the data for Italy. It kind of goes a long way in explaining the cross-sectional pattern, something that we don't observe for the credit tightening view. Again, the credit tightening view by construction should display an average consumption to income elasticity that is something closer to the data. However, what we're observing here is that according to a credit tightening view experiment, income-rich households should smooth consumption, display consumption to income elasticities of 0.5, whereas income-poor households, which are closer to the constraint, should display much higher consumption to income elasticities. Again, we consider kind of values extensions. One that was mentioned, I think, by Benjamin was, for example, changing the peak to traffic episodes in Italy. Another one was constructed, instead of a one-year recession, we construct protracted recessions as we observe in the data. We also look at MPCs, and we also look at the theoretical elasticities versus the simulated elasticities in which we average out all income deficits. Okay, So that's what I'll do now is basically I'll try to go through some model extensions. Actually, most of them were something we discussed already in the talk. So I'll try to make reference to the conversations we had as we go. One was this thing that we were discussing, I think, with Alvaro, which is the fact that the crisis don't hit the to people in the same magnitude, right? So if we use remember our baseline functional form for the income, it was basically a multiplicative structure. That implies that a shock of 10%, an idiosyncratic, an aggregate shock will have a shock on individuals' income of the same magnitude in percentage points. That's something we don't observe in the data. So one thing that we did is we actually then incorporated a more elaborated nonlinear functional form for the idiosyncratic income, which is a multiplicative and then differential loadings on the aggregate shock. This gamma is a function that depends on the idiosyncratic shocks, and it's also the loading on the aggregate shock. What we do is we estimate these differential loadings by looking at the change in the income of different income deciles in the crisis in response to the aggregate shock. What we observe is, for example, this is for the Italian case, which a similar pattern, by the way, is observed for the Spanish case, is that in this crisis, the Euro crisis, were crises in which the income poor suffer more than income rich. That is, the drop in income was larger for the poor than for the rich people. That's why we estimate higher loadings for income poor than for income rich. What we then do is then with these heterogeneous loadings, we redo our exercise. And this is basically what we find. We find similar results under the two credit tightening views. Why? Because basically what's relevant for determining the consumption decisions is not the heterogeneous impact, but rather the perceived persistence. And to the extent that the perceived persistence is something that is homogeneous, then we will observe similar reactions to the baseline model. So we can accommodate heterogeneous impacts of the crisis and still obtain the same predictions. Of course, one thing that we can do, if you tell me, hey, Diego, actually, I think that the persistence is heterogeneous across, of the shock is heterogeneous across income deciles, then that will certainly impact our results. Yeah.
Maybe not only you need to acknowledge if the shock is more persistent across income level, but if the expected persistence of the shock is equal across income level, because basically that's what they do when they decide if they want to drop consumption.
You're right, Benjamin. Every time I talk about persistence, it's always about perceived dynamics. So that's indeed true. Yeah.
Yeah, and that maybe I don't know, there's surveys or something that you could get at the beginning of the crisis. Maybe some people have more access to information, have different expectation about the length of the crisis. So.
Yeah, that's something we could look at. Thank you.
Diego,
Yeah.
Can you show the graph again? So the here is aggregated by deciles, right? So you're taking some average, right? But I guess what it is very relevant here is that some of these guys are hit a lot by the shock, right? So 10% of the first decile get unemployed and they don't have any income, and the 90% is still employed and maybe nothing happened with them. And the adjustment is more like the risk that they're facing, right? Being in that decile, they have maybe a relatively small probability of getting a very bad shock instead of a high probability of getting
No, I get you, and I think I'm not sure I have it in here, but one thing that we certainly did is heterogeneous second order moments. So basically something like, and we try to estimate that in the data. Of course, the more fine tune is the exercise, the better data we need, and the less confident I will be on those type of exercises. But the idea, I get what you're saying, which is really one thing that could happen is, for example, the unemployment risk may actually be different in different income deciles, and that could be a big deal. and the way we can actually try to incorporate that in the model. And I think we do in the one of the exercises.
Okay.
The paper, you'll likely find it. I'm not sure you have it here in the presentation. Is this uncertainty shock, but differential for, we kind of like do differential loadings on the uncertainty shock.
Right. Okay. And can I interpret this confidence interval as that type of risk? I mean, in the first decile, this interval is larger because there is more risk inside the decile.
That's a good.
And if so,
I would be tempted to say yes, but yeah.
Okay. So then the 10 decile is also very risky, right? And that's something that it connects with the discussion that we had. These guys are actually having a lot of risk in this.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I think again, like we did something. I hope I have it in here. Let me see, but I'm not sure if I have it. Otherwise, we can talk more about it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point. Okay, back to other point that you mentioned at one point. One thing that we do is we kind of like look at the survey of consumer finances in these countries, and we first assess how much the liquid wealth changed during these episodes and whether it changed differentially for different households. The answer is yes. The answer is first, it drops significantly and it drops heterogeneously. Why? Because basically the liquid wealth composition is something like this. We have much more investment in risky assets for income rich than for income poor. And these risky assets have negative wealth revaluations during the crisis. The safe assets, not so much. So this is what we basically, the wealth revaluation that different income households, different households in different income deciles experience during, this is the Italian data, for example. So we see that basically wealth revaluations of the order of almost 20% for income poor, for income rich households. So one thing that we basically do in the data is we feed in and kind of like an unexpected wealth revaluation out of their liquid assets that matches that one observed in the data. And then we look at what happens to our usual crisis experiments if on top of that, we also feed in the negative wealth revaluation, which is heterogeneous. Basically, what we find is higher consumption to income elasticities as the deciles. But again, the magnitudes, as I was anticipating at 1.2 to Alvaro, is smaller. The reason is basically that households consume just a flow out of the liquid wealth that they have, even though there are big revaluations of their liquid wealth, that the optimal consumption is just to consume an annuity of that liquid wealth. And once you look at the liquid wealth to income ratios, that they're not that big, so even kind of like revaluations of the order of 20% don't have a significant impact on consumption. Another thing that we did is basically analyze the role of non-homotheticity, as I anticipated, to try to understand the logics, the dynamics of emerging and advanced economies jointly. So one thing that we do is we introduce Tom-Gehry type of preferences, and we calibrate the subsistence levels of consumption to match the share of households with income below an indigence level, which is much larger for Mexico. We choose now in here, we calibrate for two countries, for our baseline Italy, and now we introduce also Mexico, which has a share of people that are below, with income below the indigence level, much larger. Then what we ask is, if we calibrate that, then we basically ask now what are the effects of the two views on the consumption to income elasticities. For the case of Italy, we basically observe not significant movements. Why? Because the subsistence level was actually not quite binding, not quite relevant for the most of the population. That's not true for Mexico, in which we observe, for example, now, this is the baseline model, the PIH view of crisis in the baseline, which doesn't reflect quite well the data. Once you introduce the non-homotheticity, then you basically get something that is slightly increasing, not as increasing as you observe in the data, but something that gets closer to the data. That's because basically Mexican income poor households are very close to their consumption subsistence level. So their policy function, right, in their respect to income is kind of flat. You just gonna basically consume something close to the subsistence level, and if income fluctuates, they're not gonna respond much to that, just because they don't want to fall below their consumption subsistence level, which renders very high this utility. One other shock that we do, and this is related to Andres's points. So here, Andres, what we're plotting is basically, here's the first thing that I was telling you, which is the dynamics of interest rates, at least if we go them by the household, the relevant interest rates at the bank lending and deposit rates. So consumer credit or savings and deposits, it didn't offer significant changes during the Italian recession. Something different happened during Mexico. In what we're plotting in here is the average, the path of the interest rates, averaging the tequila crisis and the global financial crisis. What we're observing here is some increase in the interest rate, but look, it's mostly an increase for the lending rate. So for the borrowing rates for households, the lending rate for the bank, than for the saving or deposit rates for the banks. So one thing that we do is we kind of like include this increasing the interest rates for in addition to our 2 crisis view experiments. And what we find is mostly an increase in the effect in the consumption to income elasticities, but the ones that are suffering the most are the ones that are borrowing, which in our model are the ones that are income poor, right? So we kind of like see some departure of that mostly in the income poor deciles. So that's kind of like, again, this is for the case of Mexico, in which we do observe significant increases in the interest rates. Again, like just to follow up on the discussion, these are magnitudes that are much smaller once we look at the increase in the interest rate for firms, especially for those for example, corporate bonds. Given that we have time, let me also click on this shock, which so we actually indeed have something related to uncertainty and heterogeneous loading uncertainty. So here's what we're finding here, Alvaro. What we're doing in here is we're kind of like measuring, again, this has, I think, wide concern, like again, more standard errors, just because we're looking at second moments. What we're doing in here is we're focusing on the cross-sectional dispersion of income in the crisis, the change in the cross-sectional dispersion of income in an income decile, peak to trough in the crisis, and we basically estimate the differential loadings on the increase in the dispersion total, right? So we kind of like, I'm doing something similar with the heterogeneous loading, but with the second moment. Basically, what we estimate is higher uncertainty for the income poor. So unlike the confidence intervals in here, we're not reflecting higher uncertainty increase for income rich. But I mean, again, like I could take a more serious look into this part. Once we feed in, one thing that we basically do in here is, okay, so this is the changes in the income dispersion where we observe in the model and in the data. And then with that shock, basically what we do is we do that shock, the same shocks that we entertain, but on top of that, an increase in uncertainty. So we do a homogeneous increase in uncertainty and a heterogeneous increase in uncertainty. It's kind of like in here, unfortunately, we cannot see much. But basically, most of the results are that the heterogeneous increase in uncertainty, or even the homogeneous increase in uncertainty, lead to somehow a little bit of higher consumption responses due to the precautionary savings. That's mostly, but basically, it's not enough to kind of like, drive significant departures from our baseline model. Oops. All right, so let me skip this. I'll finalize with the policy experiment that we do in our model. What we basically do here, again, this is a model in which output is taken as given. So we're not gonna try to understand the dynamics, the effects of policies on output, but rather the effects of policies on aggregate consumption. We consider some sort of fiscal transfer program during a crisis in which you get a one-time transfer for each household financed with external public debt, which is then taxed to repay the interest on that debt in every period after the crisis. So here's what the results that we obtain, measured by basically on the x-axis, the income decile, and over here, the MPCs out of the $1 that the government gives in the period of the crisis. Under the credit tightening view, what we observe is kind of like super high MPCs, especially for those that are income poor. That's something we don't observe under the permanent income view of crisis, in which agents are closer to being Ricardian, and they kind of like save most of their money that the government gives just to pay just to pay for the kind of like higher taxes in the future. So let me just with this conclude. What we do in the paper is provide a micro measurement of consumption responses that we argue can be helpful in informing the debate on the drivings of consumption during crisis. The empirical patterns are somewhat largely consistent with a permanent income view of crisis. That provides some sort of challenge of the effectiveness of these fiscal policies during crisis. And again, just one last thing is, if anything, I don't want you to think of this paper just by saying that financial frictions are not relevant during crisis. Actually, indeed, we're mostly sympathetic of the view of the original shock transmitting to output through some sort of financial intermediation frictions. It's just that once we want to understand for a given path of economic activity or income, the consumption responses of households, it seems that the permanent income view is quite a good representation that accounts for the micro patterns of that. Thank you.
Luciano, you're mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Diego. That's a great presentation. And I think we have a couple of minutes for some questions. So if you're a panelist and you want to ask, just unmute yourself. And if you are an attendee, just let us know in the Q&A section. Okay, if there are no questions, well, I have a question myself that I was waiting maybe until the end of the presentation, but I'm gonna ask this now, and just it's connected to what I was asking before. I want to make a comparison with the micro data analysis that try to learn about how consumption reacts to income shock, and I think here there is a different approach, because I think when in the papers that use this micro data, they first try to separate what is a permanent income shock and what is a transitory income shock. And once they estimate this, they try to see how consumption responds to permanent income shocks and to transitory income shocks. And if I remember correctly, at least the work by Blandel and co-authors, they find that the elasticity or the effect of a permanent income shock to consumption is for sure higher than the effect of transitory shocks, but it's not one. It's not one. It's around 0.7 or something like this. And I think there is another guy, Ludwig Straub, doing something, an update on this research, and he finds something similar, around 0.7 of this coefficient. And however, here you are taking another approach. You are not separating first what is, you are just trying to relate consumption to changes in income, whatever this income is, and you are finding a correlation or a marginal effect that is actually 1 or close to 1. And then you're saying, okay, given that this is 1, this is more in line, or given that this marginal effect is 1, this is more in line with an aggregate income shock that have that is very persistent, or that is maybe a random walk or something like this, if I understood correctly. So in this sense, I think that these two approaches are different, but they are also finding kind of a different results. No?
So I take your point. Yeah. So So let's kind of start a little bit by the data that we analyze also features, once you do, for example, replicate BPP for Peru or Italy, you find coefficients out of a permanent income of MPCs of 0.7, right? We're looking at elasticities, not MPCs. I mean, but that's just one. So the data kind of like, in a sense, we are replicating also the BPP type of analysis. What we're mostly saying is, look, during the crisis, the response to this aggregate permanent shock seems to display an elasticity of 1. I mean, I can also go look at what the implied MPCs of that are, which are kind of like the MPCs that are more consistent with what the BPP analysis do. One potential source of difference could be, you know, the fact that these are kind of like, and I think actually, if I would have to say this, I don't know, but I'm just conjecturing, is actually that maybe there is differential consumption responses out of a permanent aggregate shock than a permanent idiosyncratic shock, and that's something that, you know, the BPP literature looks at idiosyncratic shocks, and we're kind of like looking in here at a well-identified aggregate shock. So that may be one reason for why we're finding different things with different responses, right? But that's just speculation. It's interesting that the micro data that we're looking at kind of like response, it tells the same facts as the BPP literature does, for example, for Italy or for the US.
Thanks.
Luciano, Diego, I have a quick question. In the data, I know how you define the hand-to-mouth, but in the model, how do you define them?
The same way as the data.
Okay. So you don't make any assumptions over the MPCs, just a liquid asset.
We look at the liquid assets. We take the ratio of liquid assets to income, and then we say here are hand-to-mouth guys in the data and in the model.
But in the model, those 23% of households are going to be really high MPC households, right? Are those?
In the model, because these guys will be high MPCs. That's true. In response to an idiosyncratic, let's say, shock, yes. In response to, for example, a transitory shock, they will be high MPC shocks, right? Here, they will also be high MPC shocks. It's just that the aggregate shock being permanent means that not only these guys will be high MPC guys, it's also the other guys that are not hand-to-mouth will be high.
But I'm thinking about the slope. What makes the slope very steep might be those guys, right? That
in the model, you mean? So let's go to the slope.
In the CT.
Oh yeah. So
in the CT, right?
Yeah. It's in the CT calibration. It's actually exactly because of that, right? So let me kind of like actually show you some identification.
And then
go. Tell me.
Then my point is that there are some few papers like New York Fed, Davide, I don't know if you know Davide, or Laura Philosoph, that don't find quite that strong relationship between liquid asset and MPCs, because here there is a mapping between MPC and liquid asset basically. So say you're overestimating the amount of hand-to-mouth and you just target, say, 10% of poor hand-to-mouth, how the slope would change. I'm just curious about that.
No, okay, so you're bringing the good points. One is the literature that is trying to now, I agree with you that this model tells you the MPC out of a transitory shock will be much larger. Actually, both them, it doesn't matter the view, right? So we have one model for a state, and then we do 2 views of crisis. But it's true that for our baseline model, our calibration, we're going to have higher MPCs for income poor than for income rich, just because they're closer to the borrowing constraint, right? So that's something that is true, and that's something that is shared by many of the models that we kind of have. and that potentially the new evidence on dispersion of NPCs and one that they correlate is a challenge not only for this model, but for potentially many of these classes of models which we build on. So that's certainly true. How things would change, I mean, we need to think a little more of a structure of a model in which we have a little more disconnection between NPCs and income. One thing that I did tell you, however, is that, and I think I unfortunately I could not show you, is this type of graphs. If we did them instead of indices of income, we do indices of assets. As I said, like we got a little more choppiness. So, but basically, once you draw the line, oops, we have similar results. Yeah. So that's kind of like a little different, but this is a great point. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think that we are getting out of time. So we'd like to thank you everyone for joining us today. And we want to thank Diego for this great presentation. Now we're going to move back to practice session, which means that we're going to get almost all of you back to being attendees. So you won't be able to see, but some of us will remain and we can keep chatting a little bit. Thank you so much.